On the phone, it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Ben Adler, staff reporter with Grist.org. Ben, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Ben, everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people are reporting on this this deal with China that the president announced late, not last night, the night before, at least our time in the United States, as they're referring to it as a game changer. First off, before we get to that question, how anticipated was this deal? It seems to have caught a lot of people by surprise.
Oh, it caught everyone by surprise. They kept the discussion secret, and I don't think anyone knew. They leaked it to a few national outlets like the New York Times and Washington Post and AP maybe 15 minutes before they called the press conference and put out the those stories went up like 15 minutes before. They may have leaked it a little bit earlier, embargoed, but not for very long. They kept it under wraps, presumably because if the Republicans and conservative media had heard about it, they would have started attacking it before it was even finalized.
And how long have these talks been going on? My understanding is it's been months.
Yes, in February when John Kerry was in China, he raised the idea with Chinese government officials, and so it's been going on since then.
So tell us the details of this deal that the president struck with Xi Jinping, the Chinese president. What are the details, and then I guess we'll get to why it's so important.
Well, the U.S. has already committed under the Copenhagen Accords to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 17% from 2005 levels by 2020. This adds a new, bigger target for 2025, reductions of 26 to 28% from 2005 levels. China, which has not yet begun reducing emissions, but is still increasing them, and while it's passed the U.S. in total emissions, is still much, much lower per capita, is going to continue increasing emissions, but is going to make them peak by 2030 or sooner, and so they'll start declining by then, and also have 20% of their electricity coming from clean sources, which basically means renewables or nuclear by 2030.
And in that instance, I mean, what are let's just say one thing about 2005 levels. The 2005 levels were the benchmark basically because those were at all-time highs. Is that right?
Yes.
And so it made it easier to cut. I mean, that's why. I mean, people I think sometimes ask like, why 2005? Why not today? Because it makes it sound more dramatic in some respects than it really is.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. After 2005, I'm not sure if the exact peak was 2005 or 6, let's say, but the recession that hit in 2008 caused emissions to drop, and then the boom in natural gas, wind, and solar it meant that even if the economy picked up, emissions didn't go back up. Plus, Americans started driving less. 2005 was the all-time peak for vehicle miles traveled. So yeah, it's a convenient benchmark if you want to make your progress sound more impressive. And the 80% reductions by 2050 that you hear a lot, that refers to over 1990 levels, which are lower. So that we're actually going to need larger cuts than 80% if you use 2005 by 2050 if you use 2005 benchmark.
All right, so give me a sense of, before we get into why this is so game changing. It doesn't. On some level, it doesn't sound that impressive. But give me a sense of what China's already been doing in terms of trying to cut down on CO2 emissions.
Well, China has until very recently just focused on economic growth to the exclusion of other concerns like pollution, public health, or global warming. That may partly reflect the fact that it's an authoritarian, or I'm sure it partly reflects the fact that it's an authoritarian regime that doesn't need to be as responsive to other concerns. But it also reflected the fact that China was incredibly poor compared to the U.S. or Europe or Japan. And so, their economy's been growing, their emissions have been growing. They've been burning a lot of coal. They've just, in the last couple of years, started to come around on this issue, in part because the coal burning, in addition to the carbon dioxide coal creates that causes global warming, coal creates a lot of conventional pollution and smog. And now China's cities, some of its major cities, are terribly polluted. I was in Beijing last year, and on what should be a perfectly clear day in terms of no clouds, it looks incredibly overcast because the smog levels are like 10 times what's considered safe. So now they're getting concerned about that and seeing a backlash and trying to ramp up renewables so that they can continue to grow economically. They don't want to reduce energy consumption necessarily, but they want to switch to cleaner energy.
So okay, so they're already starting to engage in creating sustainable, cleaner energy. Why is so? People, like I say, have been referring to this as a game changer. Is it really a game changer insofar as there has been, regardless of what the benchmarks that have been set? Because you tell me, where does this? Obviously, you've got India, you've got the rest of the developing world, you've got the rest of and Europe, I think is starting to move quicker in terms of cutting emissions. But where does this put us on track in terms of what we hear from climatologists saying that we need to cut back X number of amounts of emissions to keep our climate change from hitting that 2 degrees? In other words, put this in context to us from a standpoint of practical measures as to what it's going to do in terms of climate change. And then let's talk about this deal in the context of it being a diplomatic and a political breakthrough that will hopefully get the ball rolling.
Right. Well, if the U.S. Meets its goals of 26 to 28% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels by 2025, it will be, that would require us to double the rate at which we are reducing emissions between 2020 and 2025 over what we're expecting to reduce or hoping to reduce them in the next 5 years. So, and we need to accelerate that rate of reduction if we're going to get all the way down to our goal of 80% reduction from 1990 levels by 2050. So it would be a really positive development in that way. The question obviously is, will we actually meet that target?
But let's put aside that question as to whether or not we'll meet that target, because obviously it's going to require it's almost impossible whether or not to know that we're going to do that. And the skeptics among us would say unlikely if, depending on who, what happens in 2016. But if we did, let's just live in the world where if all the benchmarks that were set under this deal actually occur, and leaving aside for the moment the implications of, let's say, India, does that put us in is that basically get us to the goal that climatologists have warned us we need to get to, or are we still lacking?
Well, this deal only goes through 2025 for the U.S. and 2030 for China. So it doesn't, even if the U.S. and China do exactly what they say they're going to do, it doesn't answer the question what happens between 2026 or 2031 and say 2050.
Right. I see.
So we don't yet know if it will get us where we need to go, because we need emissions to keep dropping and faster and faster from the end point of this deal going forward. And so, you better hope that Democrats are in power always, so that, whoever is making policy a few years from now regarding our energy plans for the late 2020s is really on board to make the drops, keep dropping. But so that's the basic answer to that question. I mean, I think to the point you raised about the diplomatic side of things, I mean, that's what's really appealing about this. That's what's really a game changer, if you will, is that getting a global agreement, getting the entire international community to reduce emissions requires trust between all the different countries that everyone else will do it. It's only the whole point. It only works if you're not the only one reducing emissions, but everyone is.
Right.
And so that's the big challenge. And of course, the U.S. and China are sort of adversaries. And if the U.S. and China can get together and make this deal, then it sends a message to other potentially skeptical countries. The two biggest emitters are doing this. No one has an incentive if the biggest emitters aren't doing it. You can't do it without the U.S. and China, but you can do it without some countries that might, only contribute 0.5% of global emissions or something. So the countries that sort of rank immediately below China, many of which, as you point out, are in Europe and are already on board, but also countries like India, countries like Brazil and Indonesia, countries like Canada and Australia that have very bad governments right now on climate change, see that there is this international cooperation, that the U.S. and China are doing it. And also, I mean, and again, unfortunately, this depends a bit on the question of who wins the next election. But as long as Democrats are in the White House, it suggests that the U.S. is going to make climate change, cooperation on climate change central to its relations with other world powers and large economies. And that, and that might affect, like your trade agreements with the U.S. And so, that's why it's really, I think, big, important deal. And it builds momentum for the global UN framework on climate change discussions in Paris next year to get an international agreement.
And I got to imagine in places like Australia, it creates a certain amount of domestic pressure and provides a certain amount of domestic cover. But so that takes us to why your piece today, the 4 reasons Republicans are losing their shite over the U.S. China climate deal. This is it must be so annoying to have relied on this talking point about China for this long and then have it just taken away from you the next day.
That's right. I mean, that's another reason it's a game changer, right? Is that Republicans have 2 main arguments against doing anything about climate change. One, climate change isn't happening. 2, okay, even if it's happening, and you say it's caused by these CO2 emissions, well, us reducing them on their own doesn't solve the problem. Everyone needs to, and China isn't going to. You hear that over and over again from conservative pundits and from Republican office holders. And this takes that second argument away, and they're already caving on the first argument because the science is so clear, and most of the public and everyone else in the world recognizes the validity of the science. So this really sort of throws a wrench in their plan for how to keep avoiding action on climate change, because they can no longer say, well, China.
Right. I mean, for a guy like McConnell, this is like the functional equivalent of Iran and the U.S. Restoring diplomatic relations, and Iran giving up publicly any aspirations for nuclear weapons, and I think on that day, John McCain melts and just sort of seeps into the woodwork. But now we have a situation where that big talking point of why would we do this unilaterally is gone. What does this say also about President Obama's agenda? You know, we've seen, unrelated specifically to this, we've seen him come out days after the midterm and say, I'm going forward my executive action on immigration. We have seen him come out and say, I want net neutrality, at least largely saying so. And now he's unveils this deal on not quite the eve, but we're just a couple of weeks away from basically what have been EPA regulations that have been punted and are going to be coming out in December and in January. Put this in a broader context in regards of those EPA rules and also this vote that apparently is happening this week in both the Senate and the House on Keystone XL.
Right. So, the EPA has the legal authority and, in fact, requirement under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases as a pollutant. And there are many different sources of greenhouse gases. This is not as efficient a way of regulating greenhouse gases as creating a carbon tax or cap and trade system in Congress, but Congress failed to do that because of conservative Democrats and Republicans. And now, of course, once Republicans took over the House, that was all over. And so the EPA has no choice but to move ahead. They are working on rules on power plants right now. They've proposed rules on power plants. In January, there's a comment period first for the rules on future power plants that need to be finalized in January. And then there is the next June deadline for finalizing the existing power plant regulations. That's where the existing power plant regulations are where the really big gains are hopefully going to be made on reducing emissions, because that's the largest source of greenhouse gases in the U.S. That's the so-called war on coal, because coal is the most emits the most carbon pollution of any source of electricity. So that's what they're working on. Republicans are hysterical about it. They're trying to stop it. They voted in Congress to stop it, but they didn't have the votes in the Senate. They still won't have the votes to defeat a filibuster in the Senate, but they could try to pass it as a budget rider through reconciliation and force Obama to veto the whole budget if he has to. And that's one of the reasons this is making them so crazy, is that when he makes this announcement with China, the announcement assumes that the only way we're going to be able to uphold this agreement with China is if these rules go into effect. So Obama is saying these rules are going to effect. I'm not going to negotiate on this.
On some level now, it strengthens the argument by saying, like, I'm bound to implement
Well,
these rules. Like, it puts the onus back on the Republicans. So if you guys don't want me to do this with coal-fired power plants, you tell me how we make this deal with China.
right. Well, the Republicans, right. Of course, the Republicans' answer is don't make the deal with China, and we're not legally bound. You know, the agreement was just a joint announcement
Right.
to say together we have these goals. There is no, it's not a treaty. There's no penalty for the U.S. or for China if they don't uphold their end of the bargain. So you're seeing Republicans. One of their criticisms of it is, like, it's not binding, so it's not going to force China to play their part. So we're going to make our emissions reductions, and they're not going to make theirs. Now, so I suppose that is theoretically possible. But first of all, if you've been to Beijing and you've seen the pollution there, you know that China is going to get this under control because they have to. I mean, it's literally killing their people. But that aside, like, you can't have a binding treaty because the Republicans in the Senate won't ratify it.
Right.
So, you know, this is what we're left with, and you know, at the end of the day, it's going to come down to a test of wills. It's just going to Obama's going to have to for once, and he's I think disappointed liberals often by not doing this, but on occasion he has, and I think he'll draw the line in the sand and say, like, this is, I won 2 elections. This is what the law says. You can't repeal. You don't have the votes to repeal the Clean Air Act. So I'm going to stand firm on this, just like he would on, defunding Obamacare. So that's the big showdown that's ahead of us. There's a whole slew of EPA regulations under the Clean Air Act, not all pertaining to climate change, but also pertaining to other pollutants like toxic coal ash and so forth that are being finalized right now. The ozone, tighter ozone regulations, and conservatives are opposed to all of that,
Right.
because all of it, they say, will cost us money, will cost businesses money, will cost consumers money, will limit economic growth, and all of them, like the EPA regulation of carbon emissions from power plants, they're going to take symbolic votes against and maybe really try to meddle with.
Right.
Maybe try to defund them in some way.
Well, Ben Adler, that sounds like what is going to be the narrative over the next couple of months at least, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 months. We're going to see this play out. And I guess the question remains as to whether or not this deal with China becomes the sort of the cudgel that the president can use in these fights. Ben Adler, staff reporter for Grist.org, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.